The way you speak influences every area of your life. So how do you sharpen this skill? It starts before you even utter a word. I realized early on in my eloquence journey that clear, confident speech is the product of a well-nourished mind. You see, being an excellent speaker comes down to daily habits. We can either carelessly consume or we can intentionally curate the content that is going to influence how we speak. I did this in my own life. I carefully and intentionally evaluated what I was taking in, all my inputs, the books I was reading, the articles, the whole communication garden, if you will, and built it back from the ground up. And the result is a system that has elevated how I speak. I call it the edifying environment. And today we are going to build yours. Edifying. What does that word actually mean? Well, the root is from a Latin word that means to build. So when we think of edifying, it is something that is building you up. Typically, this refers to something that is building your mind and building your character. So when we think edifying environment, we're creating a space in which you are building your mind and building yourself. If this is your first time seeing my face or hearing my voice, I'm Celeste, host of A Better Way to Say. On the last episode of this podcast, we talked about reasons why you might not be articulate. And one of the reasons was focusing too much on the output, which is your speech, and not enough on the inputs that will influence that. So I had you picture a flower, and I want you to think about that again today. The flower is the blossom at the top. That is your speech. But the flower doesn't appear magically. It requires an ideal environment, the right support in order to flourish. So today we're going to curate your edifying environment, because if what you read, if what you listen to, if what you think about daily can be improved, then your communication will improve as a result. And this practice of building daily habits to support your larger speaking goals is not new. It's been lost, I would say, but it's a time-tested principle that many great speakers of the past have used, including one I've been reading about recently, Francis Bacon, who was a philosopher and a statesman and had this dedicated daily practice in which he imbibed sources from men who went before him and from sources of his own day and age. The beauty of our day and age is that we have such quick access to things that can edify us if only we decide to reach for them. So I'm going to teach you how to do that in a way that's, one, practical, so that it actually fits into your daily life and it doesn't feel cumbersome and like it's dominating your entire schedule, but two, impactful, because we're going to focus on areas that are of interest to you and areas that will actually move the needle for your own speaking goals. So let's get into step one. And one note, I did break this up into 3 separate steps. So if you have your notes app in your phone or a journal nearby, feel free to write down each step. I also do summarize these episodes for you. So if you want those, you can always sign up for the newsletter in the show notes. Step number 1 is to define your spheres of interest. And this is, for me, the thrilling part, because we get to lean into what naturally attracts our passion and our interests and then build that into our daily routine. I want you to think of yourself as the architect of your environment, and you're going to pick 1 to 2 interests that fit 2 criteria. Very simple. The first is that it needs to be of deep enough interest to you that you wouldn't mind learning about it every day. So don't pick something that you have only the most passing surface level care for. Pick something that deeply calls to you. And if you're struggling to find out what that is, I have a few questions to help you unearth that, so stay tuned. But you want to pick something, 1, that's deeply interesting, and then 2, something that is specific enough that you can study it without feeling overwhelmed. For instance, if you enjoy art, that is a beautiful thing. However, art is a very broad umbrella of a subject. So you would likely need to niche down slightly into your subject. So perhaps you want to focus in on Renaissance art or a certain type of artist or Impressionism or just something a bit more focused, so that as we go into the next step of choosing our sources, you're not swimming in a sea of topics that make it hard to select items for your daily review. Now, some of you, when I said pick your sphere of interest, you immediately knew what you wanted and what calls to you. that's superb. So you already have that down. However, if you are on the other side where you have an inkling, but you're not quite sure what to pick for your areas of interest, there are some questions that you can ask yourself to quickly get to the root of what you might find interesting. You likely already know it, you just need some time in reflection, which again is something I talked about last episode in Why You're Not Articulate, is we often don't spend enough time reflecting and alone with our thoughts to rest and understand what we actually like. So that's a soapbox for another day. I won't get on it again. However, if you are undecided about what subject you want to pick, here are a few questions to ask yourself. First, what topic have I spent hours looking into, gone down the rabbit hole, looked up just because I was interested in? Another question you can ask yourself, what authors, essayists, columnists, creators do I routinely interact with and feel pulled to? And then secondarily under that, is there a common thread between those people? Because often there will be. And then lastly, what subject could I speak about for hours? So perhaps you've gotten into a conversation with someone or multiple people about a similar topic that just deeply grips you. I have a friend who is enamored with space, and she can talk about black holes, and she even made a documentary on black holes when she was in her late teens just because she wanted to. It was not a project. It just pulled her in. So we all have interests like this that grip us, and it's almost as if we don't choose our interests, but our interests choose us, and we simply need to be attuned enough to hear it. So that's your first step. Pick 1 to 2 interests that call to you. One thing that I admire about Francis Bacon is he was a polymath. So he had multiple interests that called to him and that he cultivated over the years. And he was both a politician, a statesman, but also a philosopher. So he melded those worlds and had interests in both. And he also had interests that were private and personal to himself. So he was into codes, like he created this Baconian cipher and just had these hidden interests. He even once said that the hidden life is best, which some have interpreted as hints that he was part of a mysterious secret society, while others say it was just a note on nourishing the inner life. I cannot confirm or deny whether Francis Bacon was in a secret society or if I am, but I will say having secret interests or just having interests that are private only for you is perfectly okay. So as you're picking this interest, don't view it through the lens of would other people find this interesting? View it through the lens of would I, because that's going to influence how you're able to stick with the next few steps. We are almost ready for step 2, but before we move on, I do want you to write something down because we are more likely to follow through with something when we write it. So if you have a pen and paper, if you have your notes app on your phone, I want you to write down a note of what 1 to 2 topics you would likely want to study. Obviously, what's the point of studying being a better speaker and nourishing your mind if you don't ever apply it? Okay, so we've completed step 1. We've chosen our topics. Now we are going to choose our sources. I want you to think of this as a privilege. I often think of how lucky I am to be living at a time where I can access information from the ancients to the moderns, to podcasts, to professors, to whoever really. And that is something that most people throughout all of human history could never have dreamed of. So think of it as a privilege, even if it can feel daunting. We're going to break this into 2 parts, the physical world and then the digital world, and we're going to build our environment in both. Now, starting with the physical world, we're going to use books. Surprise! Not really. Obviously, to nourish our mind, books are a beautiful place to start. However, often we are told if you want to speak well, you should read more. If you want to come across as a better communicator, you should read all these communication books. And I want to offer a different narrative. I believe that books have their place, but we need to be more intentional about how we select them. So the advice, read more, doesn't go far enough. What should we read? How often should we read? That's what we're going to talk about now. And my advice is, well, let me actually let Francis Bacon say it, because he has a beautiful quote that helps me visualize how I choose books when I'm building my edifying environment. He says, "Some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested." Okay, so let's break that down. First, we have books that are meant to be tasted. In other words, these are books that you don't have to read every single part of. You don't have to read cover to cover to get something out of them. And this is a trap a lot of us can fall into, especially those of us who care deeply about learning and expanding our mind, is that if I start a book, I have to finish it. But there are types of books that you don't. Something that comes to mind is when you're looking for something very applicable to your life. Say you're starting a business and you're reading all these business books. Well, only a portion of a book may be relevant to you at that time in your life. So you can read what's relevant, put the book away, move to the next, and not have this dread or this feeling of guilt for not finishing it. Another example of a book that could be tasted would be a collection of essays, and you read the essays depending on, perhaps it's structured by mood or time of life or season of the year, and you just flip through depending on your mood. That's completely fine. So certain books can just be tasted. The second category is swallowed, which is an interesting metaphor, but the way I picture this is books that you can read very quickly and they don't demand a lot of deep study out of you. Not to say you can't get anything out of these books, but they can be summarized quickly. They can be more of a fun, quick read. So think fun fiction or think light reads, essentially. So books like this are helpful because you're not always going to have time to dive deeply into a book. And then the third category is books that he calls meant to be chewed and digested. So this would be the more intense books, the complex books, the treatises and the philosophical reflections or the scientific papers, things that demand more out of you, things that you're going to walk through with a highlighter, that sort of thing. The reason I bring up this level, this gradient of different books, is because as you're picking your own for your edifying environment, I want you to choose ones that fall into different levels. That way you don't feel overburdened, like you're picking only books that would demand a lot out of you, or you're picking only easy books that you could read through really quickly and not sink your teeth into. So keep this framework in mind. It might help as you pick the actual books for your environment. To make this more concrete, I'll give an example of some of the types of books that I keep in each category. So one of my interests is philosophy. Another of mine is speech writing, and especially political speech writing. I have a huge tome of a book called Lend Me Your Ears, and it's a compendium of great speeches from Thucydides's funeral oration all the way to the Gettysburg Address, all the way through speeches in the 60s. It spans a long, vast swath of history. Now that book, I would say, is a book to be tasted because I'm nowhere near reading that cover to cover, and I can get something out of it just by diving into one speech, learning about the elements that the speaker used, and going to the next. On the other hand, a book that I have that is of the books meant to be chewed and digested type is The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant. I often quote from that book. I've read it multiple times. It's a thick book, and it takes me a while to get through it because there's history layered in with philosophy, layered in with biographies, and it's definitely a book that I can't read at all times. I can't just hop into it. Sometimes I need something lighter. So that's a book on the deeper end of the book spectrum for me. Now, when you choose your books, I do advise picking one collection style book. So a collection of essays, a collection of stories, a collection of one author, because that allows you to hear the voice of one author repeatedly till it sinks into your mind and you start to learn the rhythms of their speech. And if you can do this from an author who is skilled and who understands how to put together beautiful sentences, then that naturally is going to flow into your speech as well. I like rereading different collections of essays. I have a few by Joan Didion because I love her prose. I have some by Fitzgerald. F. Scott Fitzgerald has beautiful, almost flowery, ornate prose. Consider getting a collection of essays or a collection of something in the topic that you care about. It can be in the realm of science, it can be in the realm of history. It doesn't matter really where, but try to get a collection from one author or from a group of authors that you can return to on a daily basis, because the habit of rereading is drastically underrated. I do think rereading solidifies something in the subconscious. If you have your notes open, I want you to write down ideas of books that you want to use to support your edifying environment. You don't have to get them exactly according to the hierarchy of books that Francis Bacon shared, but that can be helpful. So if you want to follow that format and buy one book in each category, you definitely can. All right, let's move into the digital world. We are going to build your edifying online environment. To do this, I want you to focus on the mediums that you already consume. So if you are naturally a podcast person, hopefully you are. A better way to say is here for you every Tuesday. But whether you're a podcast person, a YouTube person, a Substack person, whatever your preferred medium is, I want you to pick creators and channels and shows to follow within the topics that you selected. Sticking with our art history example, you might want to pick a podcast dedicated to art history and then a Substack newsletter also in that realm. So essentially what we're doing is making sure that our digital consumption is edifying. It's teaching us, it's exposing us to words and phrases within the realm of topics that we want to learn about. And it's not mindless. We're not just opening our phones to doom scroll. We're opening our phones to read a Substack article when we have a few spare minutes, or to turn on a podcast while we're doing chores, and continue this process of edifying our minds wherever we are. I am biased toward podcasts naturally, and a few that I listen to, one would be for philosophy. Nigel Walberton has Philosophy Bites. What else? Oh, when it comes to learning how to structure arguments more clearly and speak with conviction and speak in a way that's constructive with people that I disagree with, I quite like the Monk debates. So any debate style show, well, not any, some debates are utterly unproductive, and I think we've all seen examples of that, but certain debate shows can be helpful for seeing how people structure their ideas and have discourse in a constructive and clear way. So consider who you already like to listen to and whose speech you would like to emulate, because it's important to have speech role models or molds of speakers that you like, that you're listening to routinely, which is why I highly recommend audio formats, podcasts, YouTube videos, in addition to your newsletters and Substacks and articles that you're reading. Okay, so in your notes, I want you to, underneath your spheres of interest that you've chosen and underneath the books or the book ideas that you've laid out, to now write down the digital elements. What are you going to be listening to often on repeat? What are you going to be reading digitally when you have your phone and you don't have access to a book? While you're on your phone, consider setting some time limits on your social media apps if you haven't already, because one note on cultivating your mental garden is that you need to clear out the weeds. You can't just let anything in and expect to speak in a clear, confident, well-structured way. So be very intentional about the content you consume and also the time you spend on short form content. As I've created my own edifying environment, I find myself wanting to turn to the resources I've selected rather than turning to mindlessly scroll, because I realize I got to be the architect of my environment. I picked these books, I picked these podcasts, I picked these Substacks, and something about reclaiming my focus and my attention has been uplifting, and it's a different type of dopamine hit. I hope that you can experience this as well, and that you can see the edifying environment as a privilege and as something beautiful that you can create for yourself. We have made it to step 3, the most pivotal part, where we weave in what we've decided. So our topics, our books, our edifying environment, we're actually going to put it into practice in our daily lives. This is arguably the most important step, because your books mean nothing if they're sitting idly on the shelf, not being read. So what I will do is give you the elements of the edifying environment, the daily habits that you need to be following. But the way that you choose to implement them will be up to you and your schedule. You may find that there are spaces in your day where you're kind of idly consuming content, or you just have free time that you're not using well, and you can slot in these better, more edifying habits. To create an environment that supports your goal of becoming a better speaker, you need 3 elements. Let's walk through all of them. The first is reading. Obviously, you can't expect to become a better speaker if you never read. However, the way you read and the types of materials you read, like essays, articles, long-form content, Substack pieces, books, of course, it can vary. You just need to fit it in a way that is edifying to you. I like this quote from Francis Bacon where he talks about the elements that helped shape his mind. And he said, reading maketh a full man, conference a ready man, and writing an exact man. So different elements that help to build someone up, edify them, if you will. Now, when you are reading daily, a few things to keep in mind. One, you want to read in an engaged rather than passive way. So take notes on what you're reading, highlight what you like, write notes in the margins about connections to other ideas. Really lean in so that you are understanding what it takes to write in a way that is clear, that is persuasive, that is engaging, because that will eventually and over time translate into the way that you speak. I remember reading a phrase in a Didion essay, and it was partake in the pervasive delusion or illusion. And then I recalled seeing that exact phrase in a Fitzgerald novel that I had read, and I thought, wow, I can see the authors almost talking to each other. I can see that she read him and liked his writing enough to borrow a phrase from him. So you can start to have these connections with physical books in a way that I don't get that same level of retention from digital books. Not to say I'm a digital book hater. Kindle lovers, please don't come for me. But it is something different. It's a level of grasping the prose more that I don't get from the digital version. Okay, the next thing to keep in mind is don't underestimate the power of rereading. If you truly want to immerse yourself in great writing and have that influence your speech, rereading is going to be so helpful because it solidifies, it makes the prose and the words more concrete in your mind by hearing them over and over. So don't feel bad about rereading, about going back to a book you've already read. Don't have this innate and pressing desire to always read something new when you have books all around you that perhaps you've read before but can get more out of. That's my rant on rereading. Do it. You won't regret it. So reading is the first element in your edifying environment. However, how do we fit it in? There are more opportunities than you think to fit reading in your day. Consider the idle moments in your day or the moments when you have more downtime than expected, or the moments when you reach for your phone. Consider reading a book during lunchtime or an article during lunchtime. Consider reading on the train or in an Uber or on the treadmill instead of watching a show. There are little elements, little parts of our day where we can read. Just look for them and always keep a book on you so that you're ready. You're ready to read. All right, practice number 2 in your daily habits is expand and review. And what I mean by this is you should have a dedicated practice of taking in new vocab and phrases and then reviewing them routinely. So think about all of the topics, the books that you picked, and then also the digital elements that you picked. As you're listening to these, as you're reading these, jot down words that you want to use, phrases that you like, things that are not in your current lexicon, but you want them to be. And then you need to start reviewing these in order to keep them top of mind. Have a running notes where you have vocab and you review them. Personally, I have a vocab list in my phone and then I translated it into a flashcard app. So now I have flashcards, and whenever I have a spare 10 minutes, I go through the 50 or so vocab terms that I'm weaving into my vocabulary and then move on. It doesn't take a lot of time. The hardest part, or the most new part if you're not used to doing it, is going to be that act of actively engaging. So when you're listening to a podcast and you hear a phrase you like, then pull it in. For instance, I heard a professor say, I'm of the mind that, when he was expressing an opinion, and I thought, oh, I like that phrase. Instead of saying I think, or my opinion is, saying I'm of the mind, I'm of the school of thought. Depending on time and place, sometimes it can be pretentious, but I started listening for phrases, for vocab, for items that I liked. And that's what you want to be doing. You want to be a connoisseur of these terms and phrases, and then have a practice daily where you add to that list and then review it. If you desire a little help with this practice, the Eloquent Unlocked guide is in the show notes for you, and that has details on how to do this exact practice along with a table to help. On to the third element, which is writing and reflection. As I've been studying the great philosophers of the past, one commonality that I see between so many of them is that they kept a journal where they would write their ideas and almost you can see the development of their thoughts and their theories through the pages of these journals. This was separate from their published works. The reason that I highly suggest keeping a journal, especially writing for a daily practice, is because it is within the writing that you become more clear. You're taking in all this information in your edifying environment, you're reading the books, you're reviewing the vocab, you're doing the helpful behaviors, and that's amazing. However, if you don't have some sort of space or decompressed time to reflect on everything you've been learning and to actually write it out in structure, you won't have the same level of clarity. So I highly recommend weaving in a writing practice, a journaling practice, or at the very least, a reflective practice into your daily routine where you have absolutely no inputs coming in and you simply sit and let the thoughts flow. So in order to become a better communicator and build an edifying environment, we must daily have a reading practice, a reviewing practice of expanding our vocab and reviewing those terms, and then a reflection and writing practice. How can this look in a daily life in a way that's manageable, in a way that actually fits into work and social and all the other elements that we juggle? Let me give you an example from my own life of how I practice these three in a manner that works and doesn't overwhelm me, but allows me to reach my goal of enhancing my speech. So in the morning, before I touch my phone, I get ready and I read for 20 minutes. Lately in the mornings, I've been reading a collection of essays, but whatever I read, I give it my full attention. I've found that reading in the morning, instead of starting the morning with emails or anything digital, has been the reset, the calming reset and the start to my day that propels it in a great direction. Then for midday, I typically listen to one of my podcasts from my edifying environment during lunch. So that allows me to listen while I'm still doing something quite passive. I don't need a lot of focus, obviously, to eat my lunch. So listening to a podcast is another great way to hit the goal of keeping your edifying environment alive and moving through your day. So that's already two elements of the edifying environment done. And then midday or later in the day, I often take 10 to 15 minutes to do my vocab reviews. I already have my vocab now in flashcards on my phone. I can pull that out and do my daily vocab routine. That one's very simple. It just takes a while to get into the habit, but once you're in it, you can do it pretty much anywhere. We've already fit in reading, the podcast, and then also the active review and expanding. Then as we get more into the evening, pre-bed, I will journal, and that is the time for reflection and writing. So I do this when I'm not too incredibly tired, so a little bit earlier in the evening, but a perfect time to have that reflective period. And then last but not least is the before bed period. And that is when I do my second reading session. And typically that is a longer reading session. And it's when I do a deeper book or a longer book. And that bookends my day. I start it with reading, I end it with reading, and I'm able to fit in those three elements. And that is an example of how you could fit all three elements into one day. So we've covered building and cultivating that garden, but what about the actual act of speaking? Well, that's what this next episode covers, how to practice speaking in a way that stretches you, but is also fun, because I think we should have fun and play a little bit with our speaking. So if you want to learn how to stretch your speaking abilities and some exercises to do that, then the episode is linked in the show notes for you, and I hope you enjoy. Thanks for listening to A Better Way to Say. I'm Celeste, and I'll see you on the next episode. Until then, speak well.